Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine a forest. You probably picture, thousands of individual trees, right?
Mm-hmm. Standing side by side.
Yeah, reaching for the light. But what if a whole forest, a huge sprawling one, was actually just one single living thing?
Uh-huh.
Like, what if every trunk, every branch you saw above ground was just a tiny piece of one giant shared body hidden below the soil?
Well, that's not just the hypothetical. That's Pando, the Trembling Giant.
Right, in Utah.
Yeah, tucked away in Utah. Pando isn't a collection of individual aspen trees. It's a single massive clonal colony.
Yeah.
Quaking aspen, populous tremuloids.
Okay.
And every one of those, what is it, over 47,000 stems you see, they're all genetically identical, all connected by one enormous ancient root system.
And the scale, I mean, it's just incredible. This single organism, it covers 43 hectares.
That's right, about 106 acres.
And it's not just the area, it's the sheer weight of it.
Oh, yeah.
Estimates put it around 6 million kilograms. That makes it the world's heaviest known organism, doesn't it?
By far. Yeah, it makes a blue whale look like a minnow, pretty much.
Oh, right.
And its age is just as staggering. While, precise dating is tricky.
Sure.
The estimates range up to maybe 80,000 years old?
80,000.
Possibly. And recent genomic sequencing, like there's preprint work by Pando and colleagues from 2024 that's really reinforced its extraordinary longevity.
Okay.
And that work also uncovered some unique genetic stuff. It's triploid.
Triploid, meaning?
3 sets of chromosomes, instead of the usual 2 you find in most aspens. And across its vast lifetime, it's accumulated thousands of somatic mutations. Tiny genetic changes just within the clone itself.
Okay. And are researchers figuring out what that means, the triploidy or the mutations?
Yeah, they're still working on what advantages or maybe disadvantages that might confer, how it affects how this giant functions.
So for this deep dive, we've gathered a bunch of recent peer-reviewed research, mostly from the last, say, 10, 15 years,
Right.
focusing on Pando and other similar aspen systems. Our mission really is to understand what makes this single organism tick, how it survives, how it interacts with everything around it, and how studying it kind of pushes us to rethink some basic ideas about forest ecology. Resilience, communication, memory.
Exactly. We'll be looking at research into its unique regeneration strategy, the incredible partnerships it forms underground,
Right.
the surprising role of decay in its life cycle, and even some, really intriguing cutting-edge ideas about distributed information processing in this kind of network.
Okay, let's start with the basics of how Pando keeps going, its persistence. How does it reproduce over millennia? Doesn't really rely on seeds like most trees, does it?
No, not primarily. Its main method is vegetative regeneration,
Yeah.
specifically root suckering.
Root suckering. So
Yeah.
new shoots just pop up from the root.
Exactly. They sprout directly from that colossal underground root system. That's really the secret to its resilience and longevity.
Because the roots are so tough.
Incredibly hardy. Aspen roots can survive and just vigorously send up new sprouts, even after huge disturbances. Things like intense fires, logging, disease, stuff that wipes out everything above ground.
Wow.
The root system is the persistent part, the long-term component.
And this ability, it's led researchers to talk about something called root memory. Yeah.
That's a great concept. Think of the root system as this biological legacy. It's not just physically there. It actually stores vital resources.
That's energy.
Energy reserves, yeah, and hormonal signals. Everything needed to trigger this massive regeneration response after something bad happens. It effectively remembers the need to replace lost stems and has its capacity ready to go.
That's fascinating. But you mentioned Pando as one clone. But aspen landscapes often have lots of different clones side by side.
That's true. They often show high clonal diversity.
Yeah.
And part of how that happens is through natural root grafting.
Grafting, like the roots fuse together.
Exactly. There was research, Jelinkova and colleagues, back in 2009, they actually excavated these complex aspen root networks.
Must have been painstaking work.
Oh, absolutely. And they found frequent grafting wasn't just happening within a single clone's roots.
Oh.
But surprisingly, even between the roots of different genetic individuals. Different clones entirely.
Wait, hold on. So roots from one aspen clone can actually fuse onto the roots of a completely separate, different clone?
That's what they found, yeah. It's pretty unexpected.
That is wild. What does that mean for Pando?
Well, it has really intriguing implications. In those studies, they found roots under long-dead stems were still alive because they'd grafted onto living roots from a different, adjacent clone.
No way.
So it suggests Pando's network could potentially integrate orphaned roots from neighbors that have maybe died out,
Yeah.
essentially expanding its own communal system over time.
So it's like acquiring spare parts,
And
extra resources.
kind of, yeah, like acquiring extra biological hardware and resources. It adds another layer to its resilience, its survival potential. It's like a physiological memory embedded right there in the network structure itself.
That idea of the root system just holding on to connections like that. Incredible. How do scientists even begin to study this sort of memory or history? It seems so hidden.
Yeah, it takes a few different angles. They use genetic mutation rates and radiocarbon dating to get clues about the clone's age and the slow genetic drift over time.
Okay.
But for the environmental memory, how it responds to past conditions, they turn to techniques like stable isotope analysis. They look at the annual rings and the bigger stems, dendrochronology.
Right, tree rings. But you're saying they hold more than just age and growth rate, like biochemical signatures?
Exactly. Peltier and colleagues did this in 2021. They looked at things like carbon and oxygen isotope ratios in the rings.
Okay.
The ratio of carbon-13 to carbon-12, usually called Dantas, is super useful. It acts like a biochemical diary.
How so?
Well, when an aspen is under drought stress, it partially closes the pores on its leaves, the stomata, to save water.
Makes sense.
That physiological response changes the ratio of carbon isotopes it takes in during photosynthesis, and that different ratio gets locked into the sugars it produces, and stores in the wood of the ring form that year.
So the ring doesn't just record how much it grew, but how it was doing physiologically, dealing with stress.
Precisely. It's a biochemical memory of past conditions. And Peltier's work showed Pando's growth doesn't just respond to this year's rain, but shows a multi-year response to past precipitation. Wow. It's buffered by these stored non-structural carbohydrates, sugars, and starches, mainly in the roots and stems. These reserves, managed by the root system, let it sort of remember and smooth out the effects of past droughts, fueling growth later on.
It's like a savings account for tough time.
A really long-term one, yeah.
Yeah.
And there's also ongoing research looking into epigenetic changes.
Ah, epigenetics. Changes in gene expression, not the DNA itself.
Right. Modifications that don't alter the DNA sequence, but can potentially be inherited by new suckers. They're exploring if that might play a role in this memory, especially in something as ancient as Pando.
Okay, so Pando has this incredibly deep, multi-layered resilience, this regenerative power built right into its structure, its physiology, its history. Yet, the sources we looked at also highlight a major modern threat it's facing right now.
Yes, this is the critical herbivory bottleneck. Research by Rogers and McAvoy in 2018 really laid this out clearly.
Okay.
Despite Pando's amazing ability to sprout, tens of thousands of new stems from its roots,
Yeah.
overbrowsing, mainly by deer and sometimes cattle, is preventing those young suckers from actually growing up into mature trees.
They're just getting eaten before they can replace the older stems that are naturally dying off.
Exactly that. The regeneration is happening, the memory is triggering new growth like it should, but it's being mown down by intense grazing pressure.
So what's the result?
It's causing parts of the clone to collapse from attrition, is the phrase they use.
Yeah.
Basically shrinking in area and density because the old guard isn't being replaced.
That's worrying.
It really is. And it highlights a crucial point. Even with all its ancient resilience, Pando's survival now depends heavily on human management.
Like what?
Things like fencing off key areas to protect those young sprouts, and broader wildlife management strategies to try and reduce the overall grazing pressure.
So we actually have to step in.
We have to intervene to allow Pando's natural regenerative capacity, its inherent memory and resilience, to actually be realized again.
Okay, so the challenge is kind of aligning our actions with its own survival mechanisms. All right, let's shift focus again back underground. But this time, let's talk about Pando's crucial partners. The mycorrhizal fungi. This seems like another huge part of how this system works.
Oh, absolutely fundamental. Aspen roots don't exist in a vacuum down there. They form this deep, critical symbiosis with fungi.
The mycorrhizae.
Right. The fungi connect directly to the roots, forming this vast network, the fungal hyphae, that extends way out into the soil.
Extending the root's reach.
Massively extending it. They're much better at pulling up essential water and nutrients, especially things like nitrogen and phosphorus that can be hard for roots alone to get.
And what do the fungi get out of it?
In return, the fungi receive sugars, the energy source created by the aspen, through photosynthesis. It's a classic symbiosis. Pando hosts various types, mostly ectomycorrhizal fungi like Lacaria, Hebeloma, Pexillus.
And it's not just a simple trade of goods, is it? There's more going on, like a chemical dialogue.
Precisely. It's really complex communication. Larson and colleagues used a multi-omics approach back in 2016. They looked really closely at the interaction between populous roots, aspen roots, and Leucaria fungi.
Multiomics. So looking at genes, proteins, metabolites all at once.
Exactly. And they identified at least 4 different types of receptor-like sensor complexes on the aspen roots. Basically, molecular sensors specifically designed to detect signals coming from the fungi.
So the root system is actively listening, sensing its fungal partners on a molecular level.
Yes, it's incredibly sophisticated. The fungi produce these signaling compounds.
Like what?
Things like plant hormones, jasmonic acid, salicylic acid, and other chemical signals, phenolics. These are basically the fungi talking to the plant, announcing their presence, maybe communicating about conditions in the soil.
And the aspen response?
Oh, yeah. The aspen root responds by activating hundreds of genes involved in establishing and maintaining that beneficial relationship. This whole complex chemical sensing and response, it's a really sophisticated form of information processing, and maybe even storage for the plant, recognizing friend from foe, modulating its growth, its defenses.
And this whole underground network, the fungi connecting trees, this leads us straight to the famous Wood Wide Web concept, right? Popularized by Suzanne Simard.
Exactly. Simard's work, including her big 2018 review paper, synthesizes decades of research showing that these common mycorrhizal networks, these CMNs, they don't just help individual trees get nutrients.
Okay.
They act as conduits. They transmit signals and resources between plants, even between different plant species, if they're plugged into the same fungal network.
Can you give us a concrete example of this information or resource transfer?
Sure. Simard describes experiments showing that older established trees, sometimes called mother trees, can transfer carbon, sugars, and other nutrients through the network to shaded seedlings nearby.
Helping them out.
Yeah, effectively subsidizing them when they aren't getting enough sunlight to make their own food. You could see that as a form of resource memory within the network, supporting the next generation.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense.
Another classic example is defense signaling. When one tree in the network gets attacked by insects, say, it ramps up its production of defense chemicals.
Right.
Studies have shown that other trees connected to it via that fungal network will also increase their defense chemistry, even if they haven't been attacked yet themselves.
Wow, like a warning signal got passed through the web.
That's the interpretation, yeah. Like a decentralized alarm system operating underground.
It's just amazing.
Simard also uses these great analogies like collective memory. She talks about how nutrients from salmon runs in coastal forests, brought inland by bears, decomposing. Those nutrients get absorbed by the trees and then circulated throughout the fungal network, benefiting the whole ecosystem for years. It's like a collective memory of that resource pulse, stored and shared in the network's flows.
Beyond just connecting the plants, though, do the fungi themselves show any kind of memory? Can the network itself remember things?
It seems like they can, yeah. There was that work by Gurr and Kircher in 2020. They showed that certain filamentous fungi, the kind that form these networks, can retain a biochemical memory of stress they've experienced. They call it stress priming.
Stress priming, how did that work?
Well, they found that a common soil fungus, penicillium, if it was exposed to a mild drought stress, it was then primed. It showed improved growth and better enzyme activity when it was later hit with a severe drought a few days later, compared to fungi that hadn't had the mild stress first.
So the mild stress actually prepared them, helped them cope better with the big stress.
Exactly. They effectively remembered that earlier experience for somewhere between 7 and 14 days, and they responded faster and more effectively the second time around.
That's incredible. Biochemical memory in a fungus.
It really is. A fascinating example in a non-neural organism. They did note it seems to be species-specific, though. But in a symbiotic context, like with Pando, this fungal memory could potentially boost the resilience of the whole aspen fungus partnership to recurring stresses, like drought cycles.
And I think the sources also mentioned that the mycorrhizal connection itself can prime the plant's stress response too, not just the fungus remembering.
Right, that's often called stress imprinting in some of the greenhouse studies. Plants that were inoculated with mycorrhizal fungi beforehand responded more quickly and effectively when they were later exposed to stresses like heat or drought. So yeah, the aspen fungus symbiosis. It's a truly information-rich partnership. You've got signals flowing back and forth, and even these stress memories being potentially shared between kingdoms, all enhancing survival and resilience for both partners.
It's just layers upon layers of connection. Okay, so a partnership built on chemical language and shared memory. Now, let's turn to a part of Pando's life cycle that might seem, well, counterintuitive as a positive force. Decay.
Ah, yes. Rot.
We usually think of rot and decay as just the end, destructive processes. But in Pando, it seems decay fungi actually provide essential feedback.
They are absolutely integral. You can't understand Pando's long-term health and structure without understanding decay. As Pando's stems get older, they weaken, and they inevitably become hosts for decay fungi, things like Phalenus tremulae and the famous Armillaria astoe.
Okay.
And these fungi aren't just breaking things down, they are key ecosystem engineers and recyclers.
Okay, tell us about that Phalenus one first, the trunk rot.
Right, Phalenus tremulae. It's super common in mature aspens, and it causes extensive heart rot. Basically hollows out the center of the trunk.
How much?
Well, the sources indicate that if you see even one of those distinct cogs, the shelf-like or hoof-like fruiting bodies on an aspen stem, it's likely that up to 82% of that stem's internal wood volume is already decayed, gone.
God, 82%! Wow, that's basically hollow. How is that a good thing?
This is where the ecological insight comes in. That extensive internal decay creates absolutely critical wildlife habitat.
Ah, cavities.
Exactly. Those hollowed-out trunks become perfect homes for cavity-nesting birds, woodpeckers, swallows, bluebirds, chickadees, plus bats, squirrels, other mammals. Aspen groves, largely because of this prevalent heart rot, are biodiversity hotspots for these species. They form what scientists call cavity nest webs.
So the decay process itself is directly creating homes, supporting biodiversity within Pando.
Directly, yeah.
And eventually those weakened, hollowed stems, they fall over.
They do. And that adds coarse woody debris, CWD, to the forest floor, which is another crucial resource in itself.
Okay.
And then a whole new wave of decomposers takes over, mainly different kinds of fungi called saprotrophs, the ones that eat dead stuff. Castillo and colleagues studied this succession in 2023, looking at fallen aspen wood.
What did they find? A changing of the guard?
Pretty much. They found that different fungal communities colonize the wood as it progresses through different decay stages, from freshly fallen to really rotten.
Did the number of species change much? The diversity?
Interestingly, the overall fungal species diversity stayed relatively stable across the decay classes, but the composition which species were dominant shifted significantly.
Okay.
They also measured enzyme activity, things like peroxidases and xylosidases. These are the enzymes fungi use to break down the really tough structural parts of wood, like lignin and cellulose.
Right.
And the activity of those enzymes ramped up in the later stages of decay, as the fungi were really working on dismantling the most resistant bits.
So the fungi are deploying specialized chemical tools depending on how rotten the wood is.
You got it. And crucially, as all this breakdown happens, nutrients get released. Nitrogen content, for example, actually rises in the decaying wood as fungi concentrate it. This whole decomposition process unlocks nutrients that were bound up in the wood biomass and makes them available again in the soil. It forms this vital nutrient feedback loop.
Feeding the next generation.
Exactly, returning those locked up nutrients right back into the system, which then directly benefits the growth of new aspen suckers sprouting from the roots nearby.
It really is a full circle, death feeding new life. But you mentioned Armillaria astoe earlier. That's the honey fungus, right? Known as a pretty serious root rot pathogen. Does that pose a threat?
It absolutely can. It's complicated. While Armillaria is a major decomposer of dead wood, it can also attack living stems, especially if they're stressed. It often gets in through the root system.
That kills them.
It can kill them,
Yeah.
which creates gaps in the canopy. Now, that can actually be positive sometimes, letting more light reach the forest floor, which can benefit new suckers trying to get established.
Okay, bit of thinning.
Right. But it definitely presents a risk, too.
How does that risk play out?
Well, new suckers that happen to sprout near already infected stumps or roots are really vulnerable. Wolken and colleagues documented a pretty dramatic example up in Alberta back in 2009.
What happened?
They had a site where a severe late spring frost had damaged a lot of young aspen suckers, weakened them.
Okay.
And then Armillaria and some other decay fungi moved in opportunistically. The result, nearly 98% of those frost-damaged sprouts died on that site due to the heavy fungal infection.
98%, wow.
Yeah. The combined stress of the frost damage plus the fungal disease basically wiped out that entire cohort of regeneration.
That's a really stark example of negative feedback, where the decay process can actually shut down renewal.
It is. And it just highlights the complexity, doesn't it? While Armillaria acts as a recycler, connects into the wood wide web, all that.
Yeah.
Under certain conditions, particularly when the trees are stressed, it can flip into being a significant pathogen.
Right.
So bottom line, decay fungi are absolutely integral to Pando's long-term ecology. They create habitat, they cycle nutrients, they open up regeneration sites. but they also pose disease risks. They're constantly shaping the clone's structure, its dynamics, over these vast timescales.
It really turns our usual view of decay on its head. In a system like Pando, death isn't just an endpoint, it's actually a crucial engine, driving renewal, driving complexity.
Well put.
Yeah. Okay, that's a powerful insight. All right, let's shift gears now to maybe the most conceptually challenging, but also maybe the most fascinating area of research related to systems like Pando, this idea of distributed ecological intelligence.
Right. This is where we start asking some really big questions. Do complex ecosystems, especially ones connected by these dense networks like Pando and its associated fungi, do they exhibit abilities that, well, maybe aren't like a human brain, but resemble intelligence?
Like processing information, coordinating responses, adapting as a whole system.
Exactly. That kind of thing.
Obviously, plants and fungi, they don't have brains or central nervous systems.
Correct. No neurons in the way we think of them. But they possess incredibly complex internal communication systems nonetheless.
Hormones, chemicals.
Hormones, electrical signals, volatile chemicals, all sorts of signaling. And their interactions within these networks can look remarkably similar to how cognitive systems process information and make what look like decisions.
Okay, let's focus on the fungal side first. You mentioned fungi acting as decision makers. How?
Yeah. Nicholas Money's work, he summarized a lot of this in 2021. He highlights experiments showing fungi actively exploring their environment, hyphae spreading out. They forage for resources. They can even optimize paths through complex mazes to find food sources efficiently.
Like slime molds do.
Similar principles, yeah.
Yeah.
He argues there's compelling evidence for rudimentary learning and even short-term memory in these organisms.
Like the stress priming we talked about earlier.
Exactly. That Gurr and Kircher work showing penicillium remembering a mild heat stress for, about 24 hours? And responding faster to a second stress, that's a clear example of fungal stress memory.
Okay.
Money also describes how a fungal mycelium, the whole network body, can sense a rich food source in one area and then prioritize transporting resources to that area to fuel growth there. It shows this kind of colony-wide integration and resource allocation that looks like a coordinated strategy.
Is there any evidence of electrical signaling in these fungal networks like we have in our nerves?
Absolutely. That's a really hot area of research right now.
Yeah.
It turns out the tips of fungal hyphae exhibit these oscillating membrane voltages. They produce electrical impulses.
Really?
Yeah. And Andrew Adamatsky published a fascinating, though quite controversial paper in 2022. He analyzed electrical spiking patterns recorded from fungi.
Okay.
And he proposed that these complex spike trains might actually constitute a primitive form of communication, maybe even a fungal language. Identifying patterns, he suggested, could be distinct words or units of meaning.
A fungal language. Wow. That sounds pretty out there.
It is highly speculative, yeah. And it's generated significant debate in the scientific community. People like Hunter wrote about this in 2023, discussing the criticisms and alternative interpretations.
Right.
But the core established fact underlying it all is that fungal mycelia do conduct electrical impulses. And they can transmit these signals over distances of meters or even more through the network.
Okay, so the electrical signals are real, even if the language idea is way up for debate. How does this connect back to the plants, to Pando?
Well, the hypothesis that's gaining traction is that the mycorrhizal fungi, which we know are electrically active and are physically connected to the plant roots, could be acting as the information superhighway between plants.
Relaying signals.
Relaying stress signals, warnings about pests or drought, maybe other environmental cues, passing them throughout the network. This entire plant-fungus network potentially could function almost like a distributed nervous system for the whole ecosystem.
So Pando, plus its fungal partners,
Yeah.
the whole shebang, could be seen as exhibiting some kind of emergent intelligence.
In that view, yes. The combined system is sensing changes, water, nutrients, pests, whatever, communicating these signals through chemical and potentially electrical networks, and then coordinating adaptive responses across the entire system.
Like changing growth patterns, shifting resources around, boosting defenses.
Exactly. Sensing, communicating, adapting. All via these decentralized biological networks. Not conscious thought, but an intelligent system in a broader ecological sense.
And isn't there even some really unique research looking at physical signals traveling through Pando's root system itself? The acoustic stuff?
Yes. This is a super cool, really innovative approach. Rice and Odit presented work in 2023, where they basically used hydrophones, underwater microphones, and geophones placed in Pando's soil to effectively listen to the root network.
Listening to roots, what did they hear?
They found that when they gently tapped on a stem, even 30 meters away,
Okay.
the sensors picked up a distinct vibrational signal traveling through the underground root network.
No kidding.
Yeah, they likened it to a giant tin can telephone,
Yeah.
with the 47,000 stems acting like the cans and the buried roots being the connecting string.
Wow.
They could also detect changes in these vibrations caused just by wind gusts moving the stems above ground.
So the entire organism is physically connected in a way that transmits mechanical signals, vibrations across huge distances.
It strongly suggests that, yeah, that the whole clonal organism behaves as an integrated mechanical unit
Hmm.
and potentially uses these vibrations to share information or maybe coordinate responses across its vast expanse.
That's amazing.
It might not be intelligence in the way we normally think of it, but it's really compelling evidence of this deep physical and perhaps communicative interconnection within the whole system.
It really starts to make sense why some forest ecophysiologists, like Simard, increasingly view forests not just as, collections of individual trees, but as collective organisms.
Yeah, she's even compared the structure, the topology of these mycorrhizal networks to neural networks, noting they have similar mathematical properties like small world architecture or scale-free properties, which are known to be highly efficient for information flow in other complex networks.
Interesting parallels.
And she draws analogies between how different fungal species explore their environment. Some are aggressive explorers, some are more conservative, and different cognitive strategies seen in other organisms. Now, these are analogies, of course, but they're supported by that experimental evidence we discussed earlier. Signals sent via these common mycorrhizal networks do cause persistent memory-like changes in the plants that receive them, like enhanced drought tolerance in seedlings that got a signal from a stressed neighbor.
Right, so all these different lines of evidence, the chemical dialogues, the fungal memory, the electrical signals, the acoustic connections, they really converge, don't they? They paint this picture of Pando's ecosystem as something that, in a broad sense, perceives its environment, communicates within itself, and adapts through these complex, coordinated biological networks.
But it definitely challenges our very species-centric view of what intelligence or maybe even cognition might mean in the natural world.
And makes that idea of a sentient forest maybe something more than just poetry, something grounded in actual biological mechanisms we're starting to uncover.
Could be, yeah, something worth thinking about.
So how exactly are researchers gathering all this incredible information? Studying a system that's so vast and mostly hidden underground, what are the tools that are enabling this recent wave of understanding?
Yeah, it's really thanks to a convergence of some pretty innovative technologies, mostly developed or refined over the last 10, 15 years.
Yeah.
One really major one is LiDAR, light detection and ranging.
Right, the laser scanning tech creates those amazing 3D maps.
Exactly. Groups like the Friends of Pando used drone-mounted LiDAR back in 2023 to create these incredibly high-resolution 3D maps of the entire 106-acre clone.
Wow.
It captures the precise location, the height, the structure of basically every stem, every branch. It creates this living digital twin of the clone.
What do they use that for?
It allows them to precisely monitor changes over time. They can see exactly where stems are dying off, where new suckers are successfully establishing, identify canopy gaps. It become crucial for conservation planning. It helps them target interventions, like where to put up fences to protect the most vulnerable areas of regeneration from browsing. They also use terrestrial LiDAR from the ground to monitor individual trunks for subtle signs of growth or swelling that might indicate internal rot.
A 3D map of an entire forest that's actually one organism? That's just a fantastic visual.
Yeah.
What about getting at those complex chemical interactions we talked about? The dialogue.
Right, that's where metabolomics and chemical profiling come in. This involves analyzing the huge array of small chemical compounds, metabolites, that the organism and its partners produce.
Okay.
Like we discussed with the mycorrhizal symbiosis, Larson and colleagues used metabolomics to actually identify the specific signaling molecules involved in that aspen fungus conversation.
So they can literally see the chemical conversations that are happening.
Pretty much. By taking samples, leaves, bark, roots, even fungal mycelium, and analyzing their chemical fingerprints, researchers can detect things like stress hormones, defense compounds like those phenolic glycosides aspen makes, signaling molecules. These chemical profiles act like readouts of Pando's health, its current physiological state, and maybe even its information state. For example, seeing high levels of jasmonate might signal that the clone is actively mounting a defense response to being eaten. It really reveals the hidden biochemical activity in communication.
And we talked earlier about using the tree rings to understand its history and memory.
Yeah, that's dendrochronology and the ring isotope analysis. By taking core samples from the larger stems, researchers can build these long chronologies, essentially calendars of the clone's growth history going back centuries in some cases.
Right.
And then analyzing the stable isotopes within those rings, like that DC ratio we discussed, provides this amazing biochemical archive. It shows past physiological responses to environmental conditions.
So the rings aren't just counting years or measuring width, they're actually recording its physiological experience.
That's a great way to put it. Yeah. They capture how Pando is responding to its environment, year by year, providing a tangible record of past stresses, like droughts, and highlighting that physiological memory capacity we talked about.
Okay. And finally, connecting back to that really cutting-edge stuff about distributed information,
Yeah.
the novel sensing methods.
Right. The electrical and acoustic monitoring. The acoustic sensors, the geophones and hydrophones are literally listening to the root system, probing its physical connectivity, how vibrations transmit through that network, like the tin can telephone effect.
A whole new way to study how integrated it is.
Exactly. And on the electrical side, researchers are placing these really sensitive electrodes directly onto fungal mycelium to measure the electrical potentials, the propagation of those impulses we discussed, trying to figure out if these signals actually play a functional role in network communication, like Adamatsky's work explores.
So, taken together, these advanced tools are letting researchers move beyond just observing Pando to actually measuring and quantifying these incredibly complex, often hidden processes.
Absolutely. They allow scientists to put hard numbers and rigorous data behind processes that were maybe speculative or just inferred before. Things like the scale of nutrient flow through graphs, identifying the specific molecules in fungal signals, finding the physiological signatures of past climate stress in the wood, tracking the transmission of physical signals through roots.
Wow.
Pando is proving to be this unparalleled living laboratory, a place to study clonal persistence, symbiotic networks, ecosystem resilience, and potentially these really novel forms of distributed information processing, all thanks to these innovative methods.
Okay, let's try and bring this incredible deep dive together then. We started with this almost unbelievable reality of Pando, not a normal forest, but this single, ancient, truly massive organism, connected by a root system sprawling over 100 acres.
Yeah, mind-boggling scale. And we saw how its incredible resilience comes from that vegetative regeneration, from the root suckering and these layered systems of memory.
Right. Physical storage in the roots, biochemical signals in its chemistry, historical records in the tree rings, all allowing it to remember and buffer past environmental challenges.
And then we dove into that vital, information-rich partnership with the mycorrhizal fungi, the wood wide web, connecting organisms, sharing resources, transmitting signals, acting as this underground communication network. We explored the crucial, if sometimes complicated, role of decay fungi, showing how processes that look like death are actually essential engines for nutrient cycling, for creating habitat, and for shaping the clone's structure over the long haul.
And finally, we touched on that really cutting edge of research, looking at the evidence for distributed sensing and response from chemical and maybe electrical signals in fungi to those acoustic vibrations traveling through the roots, hinting at complex information processing or maybe even a form of distributed intelligence within this vast network system.
Pando really just challenges our fundamental ideas of what an organism even is. It's this deeply interconnected, constantly adapting biological system operating on timescales that are just hard for us to grasp.
So what's the takeaway for you listening to this? I think Pando really expands our view of life on Earth. It shows us the incredible hidden complexity beneath the surface, the intricate webs of connection and communication that we often just walk right over.
Yeah. It reveals how ecosystems can remember and adapt over these vast timescales, not just through slow evolution, but through the coordinated action of organisms and networks happening right now.
Pando's Latin name means I spread. But as all this research shows, its ability to keep spreading, to keep surviving, it now depends not just on its ancient biological resilience, but really crucially on our actions, on human actions to protect it from modern pressures like that intense browsing.
It's become this unique living laboratory, showing us how forests remember, how they communicate, how they regenerate.
So considering all this increasing evidence for sophisticated communication and coordinated responses in ecosystems, even hinting at something like a sentient forest, what does that perspective mean? How should it change how we understand and maybe more importantly, how we protect ecosystems all around the world?
Something to ponder maybe the next time you walk through the woods. and wonder just what secrets are stirring beneath your feet.